What would you do if the world had taken everything from you, and all you had left was $10 and a past you couldn't outrun? For 19-year-old Anna Mercer, this wasn't a question. It was the chilling reality of an October morning in the Colorado Rockies. She paid her last $10 for a piece of paper that gave her ownership of 5 acres and one derelict, abandoned Army fort, a place so forgotten it was sold for less than the price of a good shovel. But the truth waiting inside that crumbling stone was more valuable than any gold strike, and it was about to change the destiny of an entire valley. Settle in and let us know where you're watching from, because this is a story about what it means to build a home when you have nothing left to lose. The dust of Covenant Creek was a bitter thing. It tasted of coal smoke, cheap whiskey, and the sharp, metallic scent of broken promises. Anna Mercer knew the flavor well. It was the taste of her life for the last 6 months, ever since the fever had taken her mother and father, leaving her with nothing but their good name, which turned out to be worth less than nothing in a town built on greed. She had worked in the laundry, her hands raw and chapped, until the foreman decided a younger, more pliable girl would do. She had slept in the hay of the livery stable, the scent of horse and leather a small comfort, until the owner turned her out, saying her presence was bad for business. Now, she stood on the edge of the road leading out of town, a thin wool shawl pulled tight against a wind that carried the first hint of winter's teeth. The town charter, as Mayor Silas Croft had so smugly informed her, had a clause against vagrancy. She was no longer a resident, but a problem to be moved along. She had a single folded $10 bill in the pocket of her worn calico dress, the last piece of currency she owned in the world. It had been her father's, pressed into her hand just before the coughing started. For a real emergency, he'd rasped. This felt like one. She walked for 2 days, following the rutted track toward the county seat of absolution. The name felt like a cruel joke. She ate the last of her bread on the first day and drank from cold, clear streams on the second. At night, she'd find a hollow in the pines and curl up, the ground leaching warmth from her bones. She wasn't just hungry. She was hollowed out, a vessel scoured clean by loss. The memory of her father's hands, broad and calloused from the mine but always gentle with her, was a constant, aching presence. He had believed in the promise of the West, in the dignity of hard work. He had believed a man's character was his fortress. Anna wondered what he would think of his daughter now, cast out and drifting like a tumbleweed. When she finally limped into absolution, she was drawn not to the church or the sheriff's office, but to a crowd gathered in the town square. A notice nailed to a post read, "County Land Auction." Delinquent properties, seized assets. Her eyes scanned the list, passing over failed mining claims and foreclosed homesteads. She wasn't looking for anything. She was just looking, a place to rest her eyes that wasn't the endless, intimidating horizon. She was a ghost, haunting the edges of other people's lives, and she knew her time even here was limited. Soon, another sheriff in another town would tap her on the shoulder and tell her to move along. The cycle felt endless, a slow march toward a nameless, unmarked grave. The auctioneer was a fast-talking man with a sweat-stained hat, rattling off parcels of land and livestock with practiced ease. Anna stood at the back of the crowd, a wraith in faded cotton, invisible to the prosperous ranchers and merchants bidding on their neighbors' misfortunes. A wagon went for $50. A prize bull for $100. A promising quarter section with water rights sparked a brief, intense bidding war. Anna watched, detached, the figures meaningless to her. She was simply absorbing the last bit of human warmth from the crowd before she had to move on, to find another barn, another hollow for the night. Then the auctioneer cleared his throat and announced the next item. "All right, folks, settle down. Lot 73. A unique opportunity," he said, a smirk playing on his lips. "By order of the county, we have the derelict structures and encompassing 5 acres of the former U.S. Army outpost known as Fort Reprieve." A ripple of laughter went through the crowd. Anna saw the town's most prominent merchant, a stout, florid man she would later learn was Silas Croft, whisper something to his neighbor, who guffawed loudly. Now, the auctioneer chided, playing to the crowd. She's a fixer-upper, I'll grant you. But think of the history, the stone, the air, more laughter. Who'll start the bidding? Let's say $20 for a piece of American history? Silence. The wind kicked up dust devils in the square. No one moved, no one spoke. The fort was a local joke, a monument to failure. Built a decade prior to protect against a threat that never materialized, it was abandoned within 2 years. A boondoggle that had cost the government a fortune and the county its pride. All right, a bargain then. $10? Do I hear $10 for 5 acres and a roof over your head? Several roofs, in fact, some assembly required. He winked. The crowd chuckled again. In that moment, something shifted in Anna. A roof over her head. The words landed not as a joke, but as a lifeline. She thought of the coming snow, of the gnawing emptiness in her stomach, of the endless road. She thought of her father's $10 bill tucked safely in her pocket. For a real emergency. A desperate, reckless impulse seized her. It wasn't a thought, but a physical compulsion. Her hand, thin and trembling slightly, went up. I have $10, she said. Her voice was a croak, barely audible, but in the sudden lull, it carried like a gunshot. Every head turned, 100 pairs of eyes fixed on the gaunt, dusty girl at the back. A stunned silence fell over the square, followed by a burst of incredulous laughter. Silas Croft stared at her, his expression a mixture of pity and contempt. The girl bids $10. The auctioneer boomed, his surprise genuine. $10 from the young lady. Do I hear 11? Do I hear 10.50? He looked around, but the crowd was just staring, mesmerized by the theater of it. Sold. The gavel cracked. To the girl in the back, for $10. A clerk handed her a folded deed, the paper still warm from the sun. It felt impossibly heavy, a fool's burden. But what was really inside that forgotten fort? Was it just stone and timber, or the ghost of a promise? Was it a tomb, as the town believed, or could it be a cradle? Let us know in the comments what you think she'll find. And stick with us, because the truth was sealed behind a door no one had dared to open for a decade. The laughter followed her as she walked away from the square, the deed clutched in her hand. It wasn't a malicious sound, not entirely. It was the easy, thoughtless cruelty of people who had roofs over their heads and food in their bellies, laughing at someone who had neither. Anna's first stop was the general store, a large, well-stocked building with Silas Croft's name painted in bold letters above the door. The man himself was behind the counter, polishing a set of scales. He looked up as she entered, the smell of sawdust and pickling spice filling the air. He recognized her from the auction, and a look of condescending amusement settled on his face. Well, the great land baroness, he said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. Come to provision your new estate? Anna ignored the jibe. Her list was painfully short. I need a sack of flour, some beans, and a box of matches, please. Croft leaned on the counter, making no move to get the items. Cash on the barrelhead, little missy. And my prices have gone up. Hard winter coming, you know. Supply and demand. He named a figure that was 3 times what the goods were worth. Anna's face fell. She had spent her last dollar on the deed. She had nothing. I have no money, she said, her voice small. But I have a deed. I could work. I could pay you back. Croft threw his head back and laughed, a loud, booming sound that made her flinch. Work? Honey, you look like a strong gust of wind would blow you over. And that deed ain't worth the paper it's printed on. Fort Reprieve is a graveyard. You'll be another ghost haunting it by Christmas. Now get out of my store. I don't cater to beggars. Shame burned on Anna's cheeks as she backed out of the store. The few other customers averted their eyes, their silence a form of complicity. As she stood on the wooden sidewalk, blinking in the harsh sunlight, she felt a profound sense of despair. She owned land, but she would starve to death on it. She was trapped. As she prepared to leave the town that had already rejected her, a voice, dry as autumn leaves, stopped her. "That paper you're holding," the voice said. "It's a heavy thing to carry alone." Anna turned to see an old woman sitting in a rocking chair on the porch of a small, neat cabin at the edge of town. Her face was a roadmap of wrinkles, her eyes dark and knowing. Anna didn't know why, but she walked over and showed the woman the deed. The elder, whose name Anna would never learn, didn't look at the legal writing. She just looked at the name of the place, Fort Reprieve. She nodded slowly. "Some walls are built to keep people out," the woman said, her gaze fixed on the distant mountains. "Others are built to keep secrets in. Find the ones that were meant to give." The words were cryptic, a riddle Anna couldn't begin to solve, but they settled in her mind, a strange counterweight to Croft's mockery. Feeling the weight of the town's judgment, Anna turned to leave, her shoulders slumped. A man loading burlap sacks onto a large freight wagon called out to her. "Ma'am? That your deed to the old fort?" He was a tall, lean man in his late 30s, with a quiet watchfulness about him. His face was weathered by sun and wind, and his eyes held a sadness that she recognized. "It is," she said, expecting another joke. The man just nodded, wiping his hands on his trousers. "I'm Robert Haskett," he said. "I'm headed out that way. Can give you a ride a few miles if you like." He didn't laugh. He didn't offer pity. The simple, practical offer of kindness was so unexpected it nearly brought Anna to tears. "Thank you," she managed. As he helped her onto the wagon seat, he saw how thin she was, how worn her shoes were. "There's a fellow just outside town, Jedediah breeds mules," Robert said, his eyes on the road ahead. "He's an honest man. Tell him Robert sent you. He'll sell you a steady animal for a fair price. You'll need one to get your things up there." Anna had no things, but she nodded anyway. The wagon lurched forward, leaving the town of absolution and its chorus of whispers behind. For the first time in days, a tiny, fragile seed of hope began to sprout in the barren ground of her heart. The journey to Fort Reprieve was a lesson in distance and indifference. After Robert Haskett dropped her at the turnoff with a small parcel of bread and cheese he insisted she take, Anna walked the 5 miles to Jedediah's mule farm. True to Robert's word, the old man, upon hearing his name, sold her a placid, sway-backed mule for the promise of 2 days' work mucking out his barn. She named the mule Pilgrim, for they were both wanderers in a strange land. The next morning, with Pilgrim carrying the meager supplies she'd earned, she set out for the fort. The path was little more than a game trail, winding upward into the high country. The air grew thinner, cleaner. The pines stood like silent sentinels, their scent sharp and resinous. The land was beautiful, but it was a hard, unforgiving beauty. The mountains didn't care if she lived or died. They had stood for 1,000 years, and would stand for 1,000 more, long after her bones were dust. She felt her own smallness, her own insignificance, in the face of such grandeur. It was both terrifying and, in a strange way, liberating. If the world was this big, surely there was a place in it for her. She arrived at dusk, the time of day when the world holds its breath. The sun had dipped below the western ridge, painting the sky in violent strokes of orange and purple. And there it was, Fort Reprieve. It was worse than she had imagined. A low, crumbling stone wall, breached in 6 places, enclosed a square of desolate ground. 2 of the 4 main buildings had collapsed into piles of rotting timber and stone. A third, which might have been the command post, was still standing, but its roof sagged like a broken back. The 4th building, set off to one side, was also intact, its door grimly shut. The main gate, made of thick, iron-strapped wood, hung from a single hinge, groaning in the wind. The place radiated a profound sense of failure. It was a monument to wasted effort, a scar on the landscape. All the mockery from the townspeople came rushing back, and for a moment, Anna's spirit faltered. This wasn't a reprieve, it was a sentence. Pilgrim seemed to agree. He stopped at the gate, his long ears twitching, and refused to go any further. Anna slid off his back, her legs ached. She walked through the broken gate, her boots crunching on fallen stone. The wind howled through the ruined barracks, a lonely, mournful sound. It was the sound of ghosts. Disheartened and exhausted, she couldn't bring herself to try the door of the standing building. She couldn't face the spiders and the rot and the darkness within. Not yet. Instead, she found a relatively sheltered corner inside the main wall, where the stones blocked the worst of the wind. She untied the thin bedroll from Pilgrim's back, laid it on the cold ground, and tethered the mule to a sturdy-looking scrub oak. She ate the last of Robert's cheese, washing it down with water from her canteen. She sat with her back against the cold stone, pulling her shawl tight, and watched the stars begin to appear in the deepening twilight. They were brilliant, impossibly close in the thin mountain air, a canopy of cold fire. There was no sound but the wind and the soft munching of Pilgrim nearby. The silence was absolute, a physical presence. It was the silence of a place the world had forgotten. That night, Anna Mercer, owner of 5 acres and a ruin, slept under the stars, a trespasser on her own land. She dreamed of walls, some falling down, and some holding fast. The next morning, the sun rose over the eastern peaks, flooding the valley with pale, watery light. In the stark light of day, the fort looked even more pathetic. The decay was absolute. Weeds choked the compound, and the bones of some long-dead animal lay bleaching near the well. Anna felt a wave of despair wash over her. Silas Croft's voice echoed in her head, a graveyard. But then she looked at her hands. They were scraped and dirty, but they were her father's hands, capable and strong. He had never backed down from hard work. Neither would she. She started with the only thing she could control: the chaos. She began to clear debris from the courtyard, piling stones in one area, rotting wood in another. It was mindless, back-breaking labor, but it was something. It was an answer to the emptiness. As the sun climbed higher, she turned her attention to the one standing barracks, the building with the sagging roof. She needed shelter before the snows came. The door was stuck fast, swollen in its frame. She used a piece of fallen timber as a lever, putting her whole weight into it. With a screech of protesting wood, the door shuddered open. The inside was musty and dark, laced with cobwebs, but it was dry. The main structure was surprisingly sound. The stone walls were thick, the support beams hewn from massive ponderosa pines. The men who built this place had intended it to last. As she worked, clearing out the accumulated filth of a decade, she began to notice small details. The fireplaces in the corners were not the small, functional boxes of a typical barracks. They were large, deep, and clearly designed to throw generous heat. The windows, though their glass was long gone, were placed to catch the morning sun. This wasn't just a military outpost designed for utility. It felt protective, almost gentle in its construction. It was built not just to house soldiers, but to keep them safe and warm in a harsh climate. Her explorations eventually led her to the 4th, unopened building. It was smaller than the barracks, built of the same sturdy stone, but its single door was different. It was made of thick oak, banded with heavy strips of iron. And it wasn't just locked. A series of heavy iron bolts had been driven through the door and into the stone frame, their ends hammered flat. And in the center, where a lock would be, was a small, circular lead seal, pressed into the wood. It was stamped with an intricate design, an eagle clutching not arrows, but a key and a scale. This wasn't a door that was meant to be opened again. It was sealed. Permanently, a chill ran down Anna's spine that had nothing to do with the morning air. Why would anyone go to such trouble to seal an empty building? Soldiers leaving in a hurry would have just locked the door, or more likely, left it open. This was something else. This was deliberate. This was hiding something. As if to confirm her unease, Pilgrim, who had been following her around the compound, stopped 20 feet from the building. He lowered his head, sniffed the air, and let out a low, unhappy bray before backing away, his ears laid flat. He would go no closer. The animal's instinct confirmed her own. Something was wrong with that building. And Anna had a growing suspicion that whatever it was the reason she now owned this fort for $10. The days bled into weeks, marked by the slow turning of the aspen leaves from green to brilliant gold. Anna worked from sunup to sundown. The hard labor was a balm, quieting the restless grief in her soul. She patched the roof of the barracks with scavenged timber and mud, her hands learning the rhythms of mortar and stone. She cleared the choked well and was rewarded with the gurgle of fresh, clean water from a deep, hidden spring. The fort was slowly yielding its secrets to her. The place was designed with a cleverness that spoke of care. Hidden culverts drained water away from the foundations. The main buildings were angled to break the prevailing winter wind. This wasn't the work of disinterested soldiers. It was the work of someone who had planned to stay. One afternoon, as she was trying to fashion a crude window covering from a piece of canvas, the sound of a wagon made her look up. It was Robert Haskett, his freight wagon loaded with what looked like salvaged lumber and a crate of old tools. He pulled up, his gaze taking in the cleared courtyard, the patched roof, the thin curl of smoke rising from the barracks chimney. A slow smile touched his lips. "Looks like you've been busy," he said. He didn't ask questions or offer advice. He just climbed down from his wagon and started unloading the timber. "Had some extra," he said, by way of explanation. For the next 2 days, they worked together. He taught her how to use a saw properly, how to measure twice and cut once. He showed her how to mix a proper mortar that would hold against the frost. They spoke little, the silence between them comfortable, filled with the sounds of their shared labor. He was a man accustomed to solitude, and he seemed to understand her own need for it. He told her a little about his past, that he had been a cavalry scout in his youth, that his wife had died from the same fever that had swept through Covenant Creek. There was a shared geography of loss between them that needed no words. His presence was a quiet, steadying force. The barracks began to feel less like a ruin and more like a home under their combined efforts. Before he left, Anna showed him the sealed armory. He ran his hand over the thick oak door, his fingers tracing the iron bands. He studied the lead seal for a long time, his brow furrowed in concentration. "That's not a standard army seal," he murmured, almost to himself. "I've seen hundreds. They're all eagle and arrows. This is different." He leaned closer, his eyes narrowing. "That's a quartermaster's private seal. From the Department of the Interior. They use them for bonded goods, things under special protection. Relief supplies, payrolls, things like that." He looked from the seal to Anna, his expression serious. "Whatever's in there, Anna, it wasn't just locked up, it was put under federal protection, and someone went to a lot of trouble to make it look like just another abandoned building." The first snows came early that year. A fine, dusting powder that outlined every stone and branch in white. The sight sent a fresh wave of urgency through Anna. The patched roof and canvas windows of her barracks would be enough to survive, but the mystery of the sealed armory gnawed at her. Robert's words had given her purpose. Relief supplies. She thought of the hungry faces in Covenant Creek, of the families living on the edge of ruin. What if the key to their survival, and her own, was locked behind that door? She had to know. When Robert returned on his next run, she was ready. "I have to get it open," she told him, her voice firm. He simply nodded. He understood. It took them the better part of a day. They used a long, heavy pine log as a battering ram, swinging it in a steady rhythm against the door. The sound echoed through the silent fort, a drumbeat of determination. The oak held. The iron bands groaned. Splinters flew. Finally, with a shriek of tortured metal, one of the bolts gave way. Then, another. With one last coordinated heave, the door burst inward, crashing to the stone floor. A gust of stale, cold air rushed out to meet them, carrying the scent of dust, dry wool, and cedar. They lit a lantern and stepped inside. Anna held her breath, half expecting to find racks of rifles or barrels of gunpowder. But the room was filled with something far more valuable. Stacked neatly from floor to ceiling were hundreds of wooden crates, all bearing the same stenciled marking, U.S. Department of the Interior Valley Relief. Her hands trembling, Anna took a crowbar to the nearest crate. The lid splintered and came away. Inside, nestled in straw, were thick gray wool army blankets, dozens of them, perfectly preserved. They opened another crate, men's boots, sturdy and new. Another held tins of coffee, sacks of flour, and barrels of salted pork. A fourth was filled with medical supplies, jars of laudanum, rolls of clean bandages, carbolic acid, surgical tools. It was a treasure trove. It was the difference between life and death for the entire valley. They worked their way to the back of the armory, their lantern casting dancing shadows on the walls. On a small, dusty desk sat a heavy metal lockbox. It was unlocked. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth, were several leather-bound ledgers. Anna opened the top one. The first page was an accounting of every item in the armory, signed by a Captain James T. Holloway, Quartermaster Corps, and dated 10 years prior. The manifest stated the goods were to be distributed to homesteaders and miners in the region following the brutal winter of the previous year. The following pages were distribution logs. Page after page listed names of local families, but the columns for items dispersed were all blank. At the bottom of each page was a signature, attesting that the supplies had been received and accounted for. The signature was crisp, bold, and chillingly familiar. Silas Croft, Chairman, Absolution Town Council. They hadn't been lost in a flood as the stories claimed. They had been hidden. Croft and his cronies had stolen a future from the people of this valley and sealed it behind a door, leaving them to suffer while they sat on a mountain of hoarded hope. Word of a miracle at the old fort traveled faster than a winter wind. It started with a single blanket. Anna had given one of the thick wool blankets to a young trapper boy she'd found checking his lines near her property. His own coat thin and ragged. The boy, warm for the first time in months, went to Croft's store to buy ammunition, and he talked. He spoke of the girl at the fort and the room full of crates. The color drained from Silas Croft's face. He knew immediately what it meant. His secret, the one that had been the foundation of his wealth and power for a decade, was out. He didn't hesitate. He gathered 3 men from the saloon, men whose loyalty he paid for, and rode for the fort. They arrived in a cloud of dust and righteous fury, their horses kicking up the new snow. Croft dismounted, his face a mask of rage. "You," he bellowed, pointing a finger at Anna as she emerged from the barracks. "You are a thief and a squatter. This is town property. Everything in that armory belongs to the Absolution Council." Robert Haskett stepped out of the barracks and stood beside Anna, his hand resting on the handle of the axe he'd been using to split wood. He didn't say a word, but his presence was a silent challenge. "This is federal property, Croft," Anna said, her voice shaking but clear. "And you are the thief. It's all in the ledgers." Croft's eyes widened in panic, then narrowed in vicious anger. "Ledgers? I'll show you ledgers." He motioned to his men, who began to dismount, their hands suggestively close to the pistols on their hips. The confrontation hung in the cold, still air, a spark about to ignite. Just then, the world went white. The wind, which had been a whisper, became a scream. The sky, which had been gray, opened up and unleashed a torrent of snow. A blizzard, the one the old-timers had been predicting for weeks, had arrived with sudden, shocking force. Visibility dropped to 10 feet. The temperature plummeted. Croft and his men were faced with a choice: press their attack in the face of a killer storm or retreat to the safety of town. Cursing, Croft chose retreat. "This isn't over, girl," he screamed into the gale. When this storm breaks, I'm coming back with the sheriff and a warrant." They mounted their horses and disappeared into the swirling white. The immediate threat was gone, but a greater one had taken its place. The blizzard raged for 3 days. The snow piled in great drifts, burying the landscape, isolating the fort completely. But Croft had been wrong about one thing. The fort was no longer a graveyard. It was a beacon. On the second day of the storm, a faint cry carried on the wind. Robert and Anna, bundled against the cold, followed the sound and found a family of miners, the Hudsons, their shack having collapsed under the weight of the snow. Their youngest child was burning with fever. Anna didn't hesitate. She led them into the warm barracks, wrapped the child in a clean wool blanket, and gave the mother coffee and food. They were the first. By the third day, 2 more families had struggled through the drifts, drawn by the impossible rumor of a safe, warm place. They were dirt-poor homesteaders, people the valley had forgotten. Anna welcomed them all. She opened the crates. She distributed blankets, food, and medicine from the armory. The supplies, intended for relief a decade ago, were finally being used for their true purpose. The old fort, once a symbol of abandonment, had become what its name promised, a reprieve. When the storm finally broke, the world was transformed. A thick blanket of pristine snow covered everything, muffling all sound. The sky was a brilliant, aching blue. But the silence at Fort Reprieve was soon broken by the sound of voices, the cry of a baby, the chopping of wood. It was the sound of a community. Croft was true to his word. He returned with the county sheriff, a weary man named Miller, and a posse of his own cronies. But when they arrived, they didn't find a lone, frightened girl. They found a dozen men standing in front of the barracks, the fathers and husbands of the families Anna had taken in. They weren't armed with guns, but with axes, shovels, and a quiet, unshakable resolve. Sheriff Miller looked from the defiant homesteaders to Croft's furious face and sighed. His job had just become very complicated. "Anna Mercer," the sheriff said, his voice tired. "Mr. Croft here has filed a complaint. Says you've stolen property belonging to the town of Absolution." Before Anna could respond, Robert Haskett stepped forward, holding the quartermaster's ledger. "Sheriff," he said calmly, "before you do anything, you might want to look at this." He handed the book to Miller. As the sheriff's eyes scanned the first page, his expression changed from weariness to astonishment. Just then, another sleigh appeared, this one carrying a man in a fine wool coat. It was Circuit Judge Morrison, who had been stranded in Absolution by the storm and had come along, his curiosity piqued by the rumors. He was the kind professional, the man whose word was law in these parts. The judge took the ledger from the sheriff's hand. He examined the pages, the signatures, and the official seal of the Department of the Interior. He walked to the armory and inspected the stenciled crates. He came back out, his face grim. He looked at Silas Croft, who was beginning to sweat despite the cold. "Mr. Croft," the judge said, his voice ringing with authority. "This ledger and these supplies are federal property. This seal attests to that. Your signature on these pages, attesting to their disbursement when they were clearly hoarded, constitutes fraud against the United States government." A gasp went through the assembled crowd. Croft turned pale. "I hereby place these relief supplies under the stewardship of Miss Anna Mercer," the judge declared, his voice echoing in the quiet valley. "For immediate and fair distribution to the needy families of this region, as was their original intent." Vindication. It wasn't a loud, triumphant thing. It was a quiet, powerful current that shifted the very ground beneath their feet. The townspeople who had come with the posse, the ones who had whispered and laughed, now looked at Anna with a new expression, awe. They saw the warm barracks, the healthy children, the organized piles of supplies. They saw not a squatter, but a leader. Silas Croft, stripped of his power and exposed as a fraud, stood alone, his empire of greed melting like the snow around him. Spring came to the high valley, a slow, gentle miracle of green. The snow receded, revealing the dark, rich earth. At Fort Reprieve, the change was even more profound. The fort was no longer a ruin, it was a home. The families Anna had sheltered had decided to stay. They worked together, repairing the other barracks, clearing land for a communal garden in the central courtyard. The sound of hammers and saws replaced the mournful whistle of the wind. The laughter of children echoed where once there had been only silence. They didn't call it Anna's Folly anymore. They simply called it the Reprieve. Anna was no longer an outcast. She was the heart of this burgeoning community. She organized the distribution of the remaining supplies, ensuring every family had what they needed to start anew. She mediated disputes, planned the spring planting, and taught the children their letters in the evenings. She had found the one thing she had been looking for all along: a purpose. She was no longer a ghost. She was an anchor. One evening, as the sun began its slow descent, casting a golden light over the valley, Anna and Robert stood on the repaired stone wall, looking down at the life they had helped build. Below, Pilgrim the mule grazed contentedly. The scent of wood smoke and fresh-baked bread hung in the air. Robert, who had been a constant, quiet presence at her side through the long winter, reached out and took her hand. His palm was rough and calloused, like her father's, but the gesture was gentle, full of an unspoken understanding. It didn't feel like a beginning, but a continuation of something that had already taken root. Looking back, Robert said quietly, his eyes on the bustling courtyard, "What did you think you were buying that day? For $10. Anna was silent for a long moment. She thought of the desperate, hollowed-out girl she had been. She looked at the families below, at the gardens taking shape, at the sturdy roofs and warm lights. She felt the solidness of Robert's hand in hers. A small, genuine smile touched her lips for the first time in what felt like a lifetime. "I thought I was just buying a roof," she said, her voice soft but sure. "But I think I bought a foundation." Thank you for joining us on this journey. It's a story that reminds us that sometimes the greatest treasures are found not in what we seek, but in what we refuse to throw away. If you are moved by Anna's story of quiet courage, please give this video a like and share your thoughts on what it means to build a home in the comments below. Be sure to subscribe for more stories of hidden strength and the power of community. We'll see you next time.